12 years of suffering, 12 years of isolation, and in one daring moment, she risked everything. She didn't shout, beg, or plead, she simply reached out. And what happened next? It left everyone speechless. What power could a single touch possibly hold? And what does her story mean for us today? For 12 long years, this woman lived a life of pain and rejection. Her illness wasn't just a physical burden, it made her an outcast in her own community. She had spent everything she had on doctors, hoping for a cure. But instead of relief, her condition only worsened. One day, she heard that Jesus was passing through her town. The streets were packed with people, all clamoring to get close to him. Most of them came out of curiosity or to see a miracle. But for her, this wasn't just another day. This was her last hope. She didn't need his attention, his words, or even his gaze. She believed, no, she knew, that if she could just touch the edge of his cloak, she would be healed. What drove her to such bold faith? And why did Jesus stop in the middle of the crowd to call her out, even though he was on his way to perform another miracle? In this video, we'll uncover the incredible story of the woman who touched Jesus' cloak. We'll reveal the lesser-known details about her life, the cultural significance of her actions, and the profound lessons about faith, courage, and restoration that her story holds. But here's the real reason to stay until the end. Her story isn't just about the past. It's a reminder that even in moments of despair, a single act of faith can change everything. Welcome to Legend's Story, where we bring powerful tales from history and scripture to life. If stories of faith, courage, and transformation inspire you, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your next favorite story might be just a click away. Let's dive into this remarkable tale and discover why her touch still resonates today. Before we talk about the incredible healing that happened, let's take a moment to understand the depth of her faith. Imagine this, a woman who had been suffering for 12 years, spending everything she had on doctors, only to find herself worse off than before. It's hard to picture how much despair and frustration she must have felt. And yet, in the midst of all that hopelessness, she didn't give up. She didn't demand attention or shout for help like so many others in the crowd. Instead, she believed something extraordinary, that if she could just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she would be healed. Pause for a moment and think about what that must have taken. The streets were crowded, filled with people pressing in from every side. And for her, it wasn't just a matter of reaching out. She had to push through a wall of physical and emotional obstacles, her weakness, her fear of rejection, and the risk of being judged. But what kind of faith drives someone to take such a bold step? To risk everything on a single touch. And here's where the story becomes truly astonishing. The moment her fingers brushed the edge of his cloak, she felt it. A power surged through her body, and the illness she had carried for over a decade vanished instantly. But this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Jesus stopped. In the middle of the crowd, with people pressing in on every side, he turned and asked, "Who touched me?" This question might seem puzzling. He was surrounded by people. Dozens must have been touching him as he walked. So why stop for her? Why call her out, especially when she had already received her healing? Before we talk about why Jesus stopped, let's focus on what this moment must have felt like for her. She had already been healed, the pain was gone, the suffering ended. She could have slipped back into the crowd, unseen and unnoticed. But instead, Jesus paused. "Who touched me?" His question wasn't one of frustration or confusion. It was intentional, purposeful. Imagine the crowd going silent, people looking around in confusion. The disciples were baffled. "Master," they said, "the crowd is pressing against you, and you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus knew. He wasn't asking to embarrass her or call her out for what she'd done. He wanted her to step forward, to publicly acknowledge her faith. And here's the powerful part. When she finally came forward, trembling with fear, she didn't just admit to touching him. She poured out her whole story. Every detail of her suffering, her hope, and her act of faith. Why was this so important? Why not just let her slip away quietly? Because this wasn't just about physical healing. Jesus wanted her to know that she wasn't invisible anymore. For 12 years, she had been an outcast, someone to avoid or ignore. But in this moment, he called her, daughter. A word filled with love, acceptance, and belonging. It wasn't just her body that was healed, her dignity, her identity, and her place in the community were restored. And in doing so, Jesus made it clear to everyone watching, her faith wasn't just remarkable, it was the reason for her healing. Before we talk about what her story teaches us, think about this. For years, she lived in isolation, carrying a pain no one could see. How many people around us are silently enduring their own struggles, unseen and unheard? Her story isn't just about one miraculous moment, it's about the power of faith, courage, and vulnerability. What stands out most is how personal her act of faith was. She didn't rely on the crowd's opinion or wait for approval. She didn't even need Jesus to acknowledge her beforehand. She trusted that even the smallest connection, a single touch, was enough. And yet, her faith wasn't passive. It took courage. She stepped out into a public space where she risked judgment, rejection, and humiliation. Imagine the thoughts running through her mind as she pushed through the crowd. Would people notice her? Would she be ridiculed if her plan didn't work? But here's the remarkable lesson. Faith isn't always loud or dramatic. It's often quiet and deeply personal. It's not the size of the action but the depth of the belief behind it that makes the difference. And her story reveals something even greater. Jesus didn't just care about healing her body. He cared about restoring her completely. He wanted her to know that her faith wasn't just enough, it was powerful. What would happen in our lives if we trusted in something so completely? If we let go of the fear of judgment and took one bold step forward? Before we talk about how this story speaks to us today, let's focus on the people who were there that day, the crowd. Imagine their reaction as this woman, someone they likely ignored or even avoided, stepped forward and admitted she had touched Jesus. For years, she had been labeled unclean. According to the laws of the time, her condition made her untouchable. Anyone she came into contact with would be considered unclean as well. That's why she had to act quietly, without drawing attention. But Jesus did something no one expected. He publicly praised her. He didn't rebuke her for breaking social norms or touching him without permission. Instead, he celebrated her faith. In that moment, he shattered the stigma that had defined her for over a decade. What do you think the crowd learned from this? Maybe it challenged their assumptions about who was worthy of attention and healing. Maybe it made them question their own faith, realizing that the woman they had ignored had more courage and belief than they did. And here's the subtle but powerful lesson. Faith isn't limited by status, appearance, or the opinions of others. The woman's story reminded everyone watching, and reminds us today, that even those society deems unworthy are seen, valued, and loved. What could happen if we looked at others through the same lens? How often do we overlook the silent struggles of those around us, not realizing their strength and faith? Before we talk about how this story continues to resonate today, consider this. The woman's act of faith wasn't just a moment in history, it's a message that has echoed for centuries. Her story challenges us to think about what we place our trust in. Do we wait for perfect circumstances? Do we let fear and doubt hold us back? Or do we dare to believe, even when everything around us says it's impossible? What makes her faith so remarkable isn't just the outcome, it's the risk she took before knowing how it would turn out. She didn't wait for an invitation or assurance. She moved forward, trusting that her belief was enough. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. Jesus didn't let her faith go unnoticed. By stopping and acknowledging her, he showed that faith isn't about being loud, powerful, or influential. It's about taking a step, no matter how small, with absolute trust. Now, think about how many of us carry silent struggles, fears, doubts, or burdens we don't share with anyone. Her story is a reminder that faith isn't just about hoping for an answer, it's about having the courage to act even when the path is unclear. What steps are we holding back from taking? What would change if we believed, even in the smallest of ways, that something greater is possible? Before we conclude, let's reflect on one final, profound aspect of this story. The power wasn't in the cloak. The power was in the faith that led her to reach out. Jesus made this clear when he said, "Your faith has healed you." It wasn't about magic or ritual, it was about trust. Her act of faith connected her to something far greater, and that connection brought healing, both physically and spiritually. But why did Jesus emphasize her faith? Why not simply let the miracle speak for itself? Because he wanted everyone to understand that miracles don't come from proximity or chance, they come from belief. The woman didn't have special access to Jesus. She didn't stand out in the crowd. What set her apart was her unwavering trust. And here's the lesson for us. Faith isn't just about getting what we want, it's about trusting even when the odds seem impossible. It's about stepping forward, not knowing what will happen, but believing that something greater is at work. How many times do we stop short, thinking we're not worthy or that our efforts are too small? This woman's story proves that even the smallest act of faith, a simple touch, can bring life-changing results. What's the one step of faith you're being called to take today? Could it be the one that changes everything? Before we finish, consider this. The woman's story isn't just about her, it's about us. It's a reminder that faith isn't passive, it's active, bold, and deeply personal. She didn't wait for the perfect moment or a grand invitation. She moved forward despite her fears, doubts, and the barriers in her way. And in doing so, she discovered something profound. Her faith wasn't just enough, it was powerful. Now, think about your own life. What is that cloak you need to reach for? What step of faith have you been hesitating to take? Whether it's a decision, a relationship, or a challenge you're facing, her story reminds us that the first move is ours to make. And here's the beauty of it. When we take that step, we don't just find answers, we find restoration, courage, and a deeper connection to what truly matters. So, what's stopping you? What bold act of faith could transform your life? If this story has moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of faith. Reflect on your own life and ask yourself, what step of faith am I ready to take? And most importantly, carry her lesson with you, because sometimes, a single act of courage can change everything. Thank you for watching Legend's story. Keep believing, keep moving forward, and remember, the greatest miracles often start with the smallest acts of faith.